You leave the party early. You cancel plans you made when you were feeling optimistic. You sit in your car before going inside. You need the weekend to recover from the week, and you need Monday to recover from the weekend. And the whole time there is a quiet, persistent accusation running underneath everything you do. Something is wrong with you. Not the kind you could name and explain, the subtle kind, the kind that makes you say, "I'm just tired," when tired isn't really the word. The kind that makes you apologize for needing to be alone the way other people apologize for being late. Like it's a failure of character, like you should have managed it better, like the correct version of you would have wanted to stay. Other people seem to run on social contact the way a phone runs on electricity. They plug in and they charge. You plug in and something drains. And when you finally get to be alone, genuinely, uninterruptedly alone, there's a moment that happens where your whole nervous system exhales, where you can hear yourself think again, where you feel briefly like a functioning person, and then someone calls or texts or asks if you're okay because you've been quiet, and the apology starts again. The word they use for this is introverted. Sometimes they say antisocial. Sometimes they just say you're difficult or sensitive, or that you think too much. They say it like they're diagnosing a malfunction. Here is what this video is going to show you. The malfunction isn't yours. What you have been calling a deficit is actually a feature of a specific kind of mind, and the reason it feels like a problem is not because it is one, but because you have been measuring it against the wrong standard. We're going to take that standard apart. This didn't start recently. Go back far enough and you can find the first moment it became a problem. Maybe it was elementary school, when the teacher noted on your report card that you were too quiet or doesn't participate enough, as if quietness were a subject you were failing. Maybe it was middle school, when the social architecture became more demanding, and everyone suddenly seemed to need constant togetherness to feel okay, and you were already exhausted by Tuesday. Maybe it was your family, a household where being alone in your room read as sulking, as punishment, as something that needed to be fixed by coming downstairs and being present. Wherever it started, the message arrived early. Your need for solitude is a social problem. It inconveniences people. It reads as rejection when it isn't. It looks like coldness when it's actually its opposite. You're not pulling away from people because you don't care about them. You're pulling away because caring takes something out of you that requires time to replenish. But that distinction was never explained to anyone, least of all to you. So you learned to manage it. You got good at performing availability you didn't have. You answered messages on the days you had nothing left to give. You showed up to things and stayed longer than felt sustainable, and then came home and felt like the inside of a building after a flood. Structurally intact, but waterlogged. Everything worked. And across every relationship, the same friction. The friends who took it personally when you needed to cancel. The partners who interpreted your withdrawal as emotional distance, as disinterest, as a comment on them. And maybe you half believed them, because if everyone is reading it the same way, doesn't that mean they're right? The colleagues who noticed you took lunch alone and assumed you were arrogant, or unhappy, or difficult to work with, and you explaining yourself constantly, apologizing constantly, shrinking the need so it would bother fewer people. Here is what the internal monologue actually sounds like. You know it because you've run it 100 times. I should want to go. Normal people want to go. If I loved them, I'd want to be there. Why does everything feel like so much? I was fine this morning. I just need to push through it. I always feel better once I'm there, except sometimes I don't, and then I'm stranded in a room full of people feeling like a phone at 2% battery that can't find a charger. I'll go for an hour. I'll just go for an hour. Why can't I be the kind of person who just goes? That monologue is not about introversion. That monologue is about shame. It's about years of treating a neurological reality as a character deficiency, and the internal damage that accumulates when you do that for long enough. And then there's what happens when you actually try to suppress the need. When you decide this time you're just going to push through, be more social. Stop making it such a thing. The first few attempts work. Adrenaline, novelty, genuine affection all provide short-term override. But the debt accumulates. You get more irritable, not less. Your thinking gets cloudier. Small things start costing more than they should. You lose the thread of yourself. And then you finally get a day alone, and you spend the first half of it recovering, and the second half dreading that it's ending, not recharging, not doing anything useful with the solitude you craved, just existing in exhausted relief. That is not a personality flaw. That is a system that has been running beyond its capacity for too long. But underneath the exhaustion, and the explaining, and the apologizing, there is a real question. Not the polite version, not am I normal, because you already know the statistics. You've Googled this. You know roughly a third of the population identifies as introverted. You know you're not alone in it. That's not what keeps it alive. The real question is sharper than that. If this is just who I am, why does it keep costing me? And why does every relationship I try to have eventually require me to negotiate for the space that makes me functional? That question deserves an honest answer, not a reassuring one, an accurate one. Introversion is one of the most misapplied words in popular psychology. The way it gets used, quietly in parentheses, as an explanation for behavior people find inconvenient, it has come to mean doesn't like people, socially avoidant, prefers isolation, possibly depressed. At best, it gets used as a softer synonym for shy. None of those are accurate. Introversion, as it was originally defined by Carl Jung, and as it has been consistently measured in personality research since, is a description of where a person's attention naturally flows. Outward, toward the external world, toward people, stimulation, action, or inward, toward internal experience, toward ideas, reflection, processing. That's the entire distinction, directionality of attention. The word has nothing to do with whether you like people, fear people, or need people. It has everything to do with where your cognitive energy flows most naturally, and what kind of stimulation recharges versus drains that flow. The guilt you have been carrying is not about who you are as a person. It is about a misdiagnosis, a mislabeled trait that got filed under social failure when it belongs in an entirely different category. The problem was never your need for solitude. The problem was the word that got placed on it. Your need for more Saul, I-dude, is not a deficiency that developed from some wound or deprivation. There is substantial neurological evidence that introverted processing styles involve a measurably different relationship with stimulation. Research using EEG and neuroimaging has consistently found that introverted individuals show higher baseline cortical arousal, meaning your brain is already running closer to its optimal stimulation threshold before any external input arrives. When social input is added on top of that higher baseline, you reach overstimulation faster. You don't need more stimulation to feel activated. You need less, because you're already activated internally. There is also research on dopamine response. The reward circuitry in more introverted individuals appears to respond more strongly to internal stimuli, thought, memory, imagination, and less dramatically to external social reward than is typical in more extroverted individuals. This doesn't mean you don't enjoy people. It means your brain's primary reward pathway runs through interior experience, not exterior validation. In other words, your need for alone time is the maintenance protocol for a mind that processes internally by default. Solitude is not absence. For your particular kind of nervous system, solitude is the active state, the state in which your most sophisticated processing actually occurs. You are not recharging in solitude. You are working in it, and what you produce there is the best of what you have. When someone tells you that you are antisocial or difficult or too much in your head, or that you need to push yourself more socially, they are not offering a neutral observation. They are describing how your behavior feels from their vantage point, which is the vantage point of a person for whom social contact is energizing. for whom engagement is effortless, and for whom solitude is something good to be gotten through rather than sought. The judgment is not wrong exactly. From inside their experience, your behavior probably does look like avoidance. What they cannot see, because they have no frame of reference for it, is that what looks like avoidance from the outside is management from the inside. You are not retreating because you dislike them. You are protecting a resource that, if depleted, makes you less available to everyone, including them. But here is the sharper point. People who cannot tolerate the fact that others require different conditions to function are usually people who have mistaken their own default settings for universal standards. When someone's social energy is abundant, they tend to assume that social energy is abundant for everyone, and that anyone who diverges from that abundance is either damaged or withholding. They are not diagnosing you. They are projecting a measurement tool that was never calibrated for you. The confidence with which someone misunderstands you is not evidence that they are right. The need for high-quantity solitude is not just the absence of a problem, it is the presence of a capacity. Minds that require substantial alone time to function have, by necessity, developed a relationship with their own interior that most people never build. Because you have spent significant portions of your life in your own company, you have had to learn how to be a productive and inhabitable inner environment. You have developed the capacity for sustained, uninterrupted thought that is increasingly rare. You process complexity better in silence. You generate ideas by letting them run without the interruption of external social feedback loops. There is a reason that a disproportionate number of writers, researchers, mathematicians, composers, and long-form thinkers identify as strongly introverted, not because introverts are smarter, because the cognitive work those fields require, deep, sustained, uninterrupted processing, happens to align precisely with what introverted nervous systems do naturally in solitude. The capacity for extended interior work is not a consolation prize for not being good at parties. It is a genuinely rare cognitive resource. What you have been apologizing for is what makes your thinking worth something. Here is the distinction that changes everything. When this trait is suppressed, when you override your solitude needs consistently, when you run chronic social debt, when you perform availability you don't have, it does not look like the trait at work. It looks like its pathological inverse. You become less connected to people, not more, because you are too depleted to actually be present. You become less creative, less sharp, less yourself. You start using the solitude you do get as pure recovery rather than as the productive interior space it should be. The trait in suppression looks like exhaustion, irritability, disconnection, and creative flatness. When the trait is used, when you protect the solitude you need without apology, structure your relationships around honest availability, and stop performing energy you don't have, something different happens. Your social time becomes genuinely higher quality because you arrive at it with actual capacity. Your interior work deepens and produces more. You stop running a social deficit that warps everything downstream of it. You become, counterintuitively, more connected, not because you are seeing people more often, but because when you do, you are actually there. The trait does not need to be managed. It needs to be honored. And the difference between those two words is your entire quality of life. The language you use internally shapes what you believe about yourself. And right now, if you are sent ill using the word introvert as a synonym for deficient, or describing your solitude needs as being bad at socializing, you are running corrupted code. Here is the replacement. When you feel the need for alone time, you do not tell yourself you are withdrawing. You tell yourself you are processing. When you decline a social invitation, you are not avoiding. You are managing capacity. When you spend a Saturday alone, you are not being antisocial. You are doing the cognitive maintenance that makes everything else possible. These are not euphemisms. They are accurate descriptions. Processing, capacity, maintenance. These are functional words. They describe what is actually happening in your nervous system when you need solitude. The old language treated your need as a symptom. The new language treats it as a system requirement. Systems have requirements. That is not weakness. That is how systems work. Beyond the specific vocabulary, there is a larger internal language shift that matters more than any single word. Stop using the phrase, "I should be better at this." That phrase encodes the assumption that there is a correct version of you who does not need what you need, and that you are a failed approximation of that version. There is no such version. There is only the version that functions and the version that is suppressed. You do not need to be better at socializing. You need to be more accurate about what you require to socialize well. The next time someone comments on your solitude needs, implies you're antisocial, asks why you always leave early, suggests you should be more social, tells you you're hard to reach, you will need a response that does not apologize, does not over-explain, and does not invite the debate. Here it is. I function better with more time alone than most people need. That's how I'm built. That is 2 sentences. The first names the reality. The second closes the frame. It does not ask for their approval. It does not offer a justification they can argue with. It does not open a negotiation. And critically, it does not use the word introvert, because that word now carries enough baggage that it invites a conversation you do not need to have. Notice what the protocol does not include: an apology. You are not sorry for being built the way you are built. You are not sorry that your system requires specific inputs to run well. A person with a gluten intolerance does not apologize for not eating bread at your dinner party. They simply do not eat the bread. You do not apologize for the cognitive inputs your nervous system requires. You simply operate within them. Ownership is not the same as pride. Pride performs. Ownership simply operates. A person who is moved from treating their solitude needs as a liability to owning them does not announce it. They do not post about introversion, or wear it as an identity badge, or spend social energy explaining the neuroscience. They simply stop treating the need as a negotiating position. They stop asking permission for solitude, framing it as temporary, or presenting it as something they are working on. They structure their life around what they actually require, and they do so without the accompanying internal apology. Ownership looks like scheduling solitude before you need it, rather than waiting until you are depleted and then scrambling. It looks like declining invitations with complete sentences that don't trail off into vague illness or exhaustion. It looks like having relationships where the other person knows that your availability is genuine when offered but not infinite by default, and where that knowledge has been earned through direct communication rather than repeated cancellations. It looks like a person who does not experience every weekend alone as something that needs to be justified, not because they have achieved some meditative acceptance, but because they have made a practical, sober assessment of how they function and have decided that accurate self-knowledge is more useful than persistent self-accusation. That posture, practical, clear, without performance, is what ownership looks like, not radical self-love, just operational honesty. Ownership is not the same as pride. Pride performs. Ownership simply operates. A person who has moved from treating their solitude needs as a liability to owning them does not announce it. They do not post about introversion or wear it as an identity badge or spend social energy explaining the neuroscience. They simply stop treating the need as a negotiating position. They stop asking permission for solitude, framing it as temporary, or presenting it as something they are working on. They structure their life around what they actually require, and they do so without the accompanying internal apology. Ownership looks like scheduling solitude before you need it, rather than waiting until you are depleted and then scrambling. It looks like declining invitations with complete sentences that don't trail off into vague illness or exhaustion. It looks like having relationships where the other person knows that your availability is genuine when offered but not infinite by default, and where that knowledge has been earned through direct communication rather than repeated cancellations. It looks like a person who does not experience every weekend alone as something that needs to be justified. not because they have achieved some meditative acceptance, but because they have made a practical, sober assessment of how they function, and have decided that accurate self-knowledge is more useful than persistent self-causation. That posture, practical, clear, without performance, is what ownership looks like. Not radical self-love, just operational honesty. You have been measuring yourself against a social standard that was built for a different kind of nervous system, and then presented as universal. The standard says that healthy people are available, that connection requires frequency, that the desire for solitude is something to be outgrown, that the well-adjusted adult does not feel depleted by the ordinary social demands of an ordinary week. That standard was not constructed from a neutral assessment of how human beings actually vary. It was constructed from the majority experience, and then applied to everyone. You are not in the majority on this, and the cost of being measured by a majority-designed standard has not been that you are actually deficient. It has been that you have spent years of energy defending yourself against a false charge. The exhaustion you feel is not entirely about your nervous system's solitude requirements. A significant portion of it comes from the ongoing work of existing inside a story that is wrong about you. Here is what is actually true about you right now. You are not broken. You are not antisocial. You are not cold, or difficult, or incapable of real connection. You are a person whose inner life is dense and active and running continuously. And that inner life requires conditions to function at its actual capacity, rather than at the depleted partial capacity you have been operating at while trying to approximate a social standard that was never yours. Every version of you that other people have judged as too quiet, too withdrawn, too much alone, that was not you failing. That was you running a system that was not designed to run under those conditions, and doing it anyway, and wondering why it kept breaking. The people who have connected most genuinely with you, you know who they are, did know, to connect with you, because you performed better availability. They connected with you because at some point you showed up as yourself, with the actual interior you carry, and they recognized something in it. That recognition does not happen in performance. It only happens in presence. And your presence, when it is real, is the product of exactly the solitude you have been taught to be ashamed of. You do not need to become more social. You do not need to need less. You need to stop funding someone else's comfort with your own capacity. You need to protect the conditions that produce the version of you that is actually worth knowing, and trust that the people worth knowing will meet you there. The guilt was never information about who you are. It was information about the distance between your actual design and the template you were handed. That distance is not yours to close.